of the seminarians would like to be called to this church, and nobody responded. So I think it has some interesting issues, but out of those issues, we get some amazing, rich, and deep theological perspectives. Let's jump off. First of all, going back to the context of what's going on here. Paul's in the middle of his second missionary journey. He's been traveling up here through Asia and would like to get into some of the Galatia area, but the Spirit prevents him. And then he heads up towards the Black Sea, and he wants to be up in Bithynia, and again, the Spirit prevents him. And so he goes down to the Aegean Sea into Troas, and there he has that famous vision where he sees a man from Macedonia calling out and pleading and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." So Paul immediately gets on a ship and heads over into what is modern-day Greece. So at this point, the message of the gospel moves from what's modern-day Turkey over into modern-day Greece. And Paul sets up a church in Philippi, and then Thessalonica and Berea, but it's not without a significant amount of opposition. And the opponents, interestingly, not only do they drive him out of town, but then they follow him to the next town. And so he ends up being driven down towards the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and he ends up at Athens, where he gives that famous address at the Areopagus. We call it the Mars Hill address. And then he goes across, and he goes across to Corinth, which is where our story begins today. And he is in Corinth for about 18 months, about a year and a half. And when he gets to Corinth, the first thing he does is connect with a couple named Aquila and Priscilla, who have fled to Corinth from Rome, and they are tent makers like him. And so they become close friends, and this relationship actually continues all the way through Paul's ministry. And as usual, Paul starts the same way he does in all the other cities. He goes first to the synagogue. But when he gets thrown out of the synagogue, he says, okay, from now on I'll go to the Gentiles. And so he literally physically moves next door to the home of Titius Justus, who actually has a very nice home next door to the synagogue, but not before Crispus, who is the head of the synagogue, becomes a Christian, and a number of other Corinthians, and so they follow him over and they begin this meeting, and that's the beginning of the church in Corinth. But during this time, he has another vision. And God says to him, don't be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I'm with you. No one's going to lay a hand on you or harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people. And I think that's an interesting word to Paul that helps him be so committed to the church in Corinth. Now, the Jews unite against Paul, and they bring him before the Roman proconsul Gallio. And Gallio basically doesn't even, before Paul can open his mouth, he just dismisses it as a sectarian squabble and won't even listen to this. But the interesting thing is that piece of data gives us a point at which to be able to date Paul's time in Corinth, because there are archaeological inscriptions that have been found that indicate that Gallio was the proconsul in Corinth in 51 CE. So Paul stays in Corinth for 18 months and establishes the church there, teaching and preaching. He heads back to Jerusalem via Ephesus, taking Aquila and Priscilla with him, leaving them in Ephesus while he goes back to Jerusalem to meet with the elders in Jerusalem. And Aquila and Priscilla oversee the church there in Ephesus during that time. When Paul's done in Jerusalem, he returns to Ephesus and spends 3 years there. And during that time, he gets some disturbing news about the church in Corinth. And there is correspondence and there are visits, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I'd like you to imagine that you are a journalist and you're writing an article on a very well-known person and his friends, and you're doing research. This person is dead, the friends are dead, but you've been given access to the old computer of one of the friends. However, it's been infected by a virus, so you have a friend that's a computer geek, and he helps you try to restore what's on the computer. But all you can get is to restore part of the email server, and you get a few emails and some fragments. The sent box is completely destroyed, so there's no data from that. So you've got these bits and pieces, plus you've got some travel notes from a travel journal, and you're trying to reconstruct this relationship. How challenging do you think it would be to understand what's going on? Have you ever listened to a phone call where you're only hearing half of the phone call? Now chop it up into pieces. That's what we have with the letters, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Because they aren't even his first and second letters. They are pieces and parts of a bigger sense of communication. And I'd like to suggest that because of this multi-letter exchange and personal visits, most of which we don't have any record of, that trying to understand these two books, these two epistles, can be challenging at times, because Paul often refers to other letters and other visits that we have no knowledge of. So it's like a conversation that we are only dipping into with little pieces. So trying to put the pieces together from what's said in Acts, from Luke's recordings in Acts, the travel journal, and from 1st and 2nd Corinthians and some other allusions in the epistles, we can kind of guess at what is possibly reconstructing what possibly went on in terms of his relationship with the Corinthians. So first he has his first visit to Corinth, and because of Gallio, we know that's about 51, 52, and he's there for 18 months. Next, others visit Corinth, and during that time Apollos and Peter and others visit the young church, and Paul is over in Ephesus. But these other visitors, some of them create quite a bit of spiritual confusion and contradict some of Paul's teachings. So at this point, Paul writes letter A, we're going to call it. And letter A he refers to as the previous letter. And he's writing this from Ephesus, and some of his admonitions in this letter are misunderstood. Then Paul gets word from Chloe's people, the family of household of Chloe, that factions have arisen and they're threatening the life of the church. And he also receives a letter at this time from Corinth, probably brought by Stephanus and Fortunatus. He has visits from a number of folks. So people are coming over. He's getting news from Ephesus. He's getting letters. And these letters have questions in them. What should we do about this? What should we do about that? So at this point, Paul writes letter B, which is what we call 1 Corinthians. This letter does not clear things up. There continues to be additional challenges to Paul's authority. So at this point, Paul makes a second visit to Corinth. And this trip was brief, painful, and apparently ineffective, because he describes it in 2 Corinthians as the painful visit. Then Paul writes letter C. And letter C is a severe letter of rebuke. He calls it in 2 Corinthians the letter of tears. And several times he refers to this. Titus is commissioned to carry this letter to Corinth. And then, because it's winter, he's supposed to return via Macedonia and down into Troas. And Paul's waiting for him to come back, and finally he can't take it any longer, and he takes off up to Troas to try to find Titus, doesn't find him, so he crosses over into Macedonia, finally finds Titus, and fortunately the news is good. And the situation has improved immeasurably, and Paul is very excited. He immediately sends off another letter, letter D, and this is what we call 2 Corinthians. And then Paul indicates his interest in visiting them again, so after spending some time in northern Greece, he goes on and makes a third visit to Corinth. And we understand that based on Acts 20, because it indicates he spent 3 months there in Greece after his stay in Ephesus. So this is also the place last week Carter talked about where he wrote the epistle to the Romans from. And he said salutations. We understand this because he said salutations to the letter to the Romans from a number of the principal members of the church in Corinth. So, thinking about these letters, I think it's important for us to understand a little bit about the context of Corinth and what it was like as a city for us to understand the letters, because the city itself impacts a lot of the problems that the church is having. First of all, it was a capital city. And it's interesting, it'll be interesting, a lot of the things about Corinth are I found very similar to Madison, which may give you pause. So it's a capital city. The ancient city of Corinth during the Hellenistic period had a population of 90,000 people. And after the citizens rebelled against Rome, the city was completely destroyed. The citizens sold off into slavery. And in 146 BC, then a century later, Julius Caesar probably rebuilds the city, and it returns to its previous size and influence. Just outside the city, they held the Isthmian Games. Remember, they were held every 2 years, and they drew athletes from all over. Remember what Carter said about breaded circuses? This was part of that. And the Isthmian Games occurred even during the century that the city was destroyed. So it's an isthmus city. Like Madison, it was in the isthmus between the Corinthian Gulf and the Sardinic Gulf. And this was a strategic location that ensured its commercial prosperity. In fact, because the trip around the Peloponnesian Peninsula, that 400-mile trip, not only added time, but was so dangerous, they would unload, the small ships they actually dragged across a wooden tramway from one side of the isthmus to the other, if you can imagine that. In those days, they set up wooden rails. The larger ones, they unloaded and carted the goods over to the other side. So it was an interesting city. It was also a cosmopolitan city. Given its proximity to Athens, Corinth had all the characteristics of a cosmopolitan city. It had a diverse population, ethnically, politically, and culturally. The reality was reflected both in the fact that it had a synagogue and dozens of temples to pagan gods. It was what we might call progressive, and there were lots of independent thinkers. And finally, it was known for its sexual immorality. Both the old city and the Roman colony were known far and wide for the sexual looseness. This is the Acrocorinth, and up on top of there was the temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and that represented the lust that pervaded the society. At one point, that temple up there had 1,000 prostitute priestesses. There was even a Greek verb at that time that meant to act like a Corinthian, and people understood it to mean sexually loose. The church itself was made up of primarily Gentiles, and they were not familiar with the strict morality that was characteristics of the Jews. That was kind of foreign to them. Instead, they considered this to be a normal part of life. What was the big deal? So these characteristics really impact a lot of what we see coming up in the church and in the message to the Corinthians. The first is that the population consisted of Romans, Greeks, Orientals, and men of adventure from all around the world. And the absence of an established aristocracy led the people to be democratic and intolerant of control. And this independent spirit carried over into the church, so that people were lining up behind their favorite leader, and partisanship in the church was a big problem. Paul hears from Chloe's household that some people are saying, I'm of Paul, and others are saying, I belong to Cephas, and some are saying, I belong to Apollos. And Paul gets very upset with this, and he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who watered is anything, but only God who gives the growth. So don't boast in all these things. You are one, okay? The second thing that impacts the church is that the immorality of the city showed up in an acceptance of immorality among church members. Paul hears that a man is living with his stepmother, and he is aghast at this, and even the pagans won't put up with this. And he writes to clarify that this is a sin and it needs to be judged. And he clarifies what he said in his previous letter, that immorality among the immoral, he asked them to not associate with, is those among believers. He says if you were going to not associate with immoral people, you'd have to leave the city. So the third thing that comes up and he's concerned about is lawsuits among believers. And again, I think this comes out of the factious nature of the city, showed up in this litigious spirit. And Paul hears that church members are filing lawsuits against each other. And he says, and they're going before pagan judges, and he says, isn't there someone in the church who's qualified enough to judge between you? But the bigger issue that he expresses angst about is that they should be living lives that are marked by grace and forgiveness, and lawsuits shouldn't even exist. He says, in fact, to have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not be willing to be wronged or defrauded? So, in the end, Paul is concerned about several of these issues that stem out of what's going on. Now he turns to what they've asked in their letter. And he concludes that your lives are new, and you've been made new and cleansed by God, so live new lives, not influenced by the culture. Next, he turns his attention to the things they asked him questions about, and you can see this because every one of the chapters where he addresses the questions, he starts with, now concerning the matter of, and he goes on to talk about it. And his first question, you can imagine, with all this talk about sexual immorality, their question is, well, is sex bad? Should we forget it altogether? And he says, no, sex isn't bad, but only in the context of marriage. And then the next question is, well, what about if you're married to a non-believer? Now, realize that Paul has just come in, proclaimed the gospel, and there's a lot of people who have decided to follow Christ, but not necessarily in some situations. Maybe a husband did and a wife didn't, or a wife did and a husband didn't. And so their question is, what do we do here? And he says that if the spouse is willing to stay in the marriage, hold on to them. But if they want to separate, then let them go. And in the middle of this answering this question, he goes in very deeply into what he says. He encouraged them to stay in their assigned position, which seems very interesting because he says if you're married, stay married. If you're single, stay single. But even if you're circumcised, don't try to be uncircumcised. And if you're uncircumcised, don't try to be circumcised. And his whole point here goes back to something that Carter and Rich mentioned, that there was this debate about if people were to become Christians, did they need to first become Jews? Did they need to follow the Jewish law? And Paul, even though he's a Jew and a Pharisee, he feels very strongly that God is calling all people of different ethnicities and nations and tribes into his church, and they don't need to become Jews in order to become Christians. And this is a significant issue for Paul. He goes back to the questions. Is it okay to eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols? And his answer is yes, unless it causes a new believer to be confused or to conclude idol worship is okay. Now, this is a more complex question than it appears in our 21st century culture. Because of the dozens and dozens of temples, virtually all the meat that was sold in the market had been sacrificed in one of these temples to idols. And even furthermore, most of the social events occurred in these temples. So you can see for these new Christians to abstain from the meat and these temples meant they were basically cutting off all of their social life. And their reasoning was that these idols were just pieces of wood, and since they didn't really exist, sacrificing to them was meaningless, so it didn't really have any impact on you to eat the meat sacrificed to idols. But other believers saw these idols as representing a spiritual evil that they felt taking the meat into their bodies was taking that evil into their bodies. And so they felt that they needed to become vegetarians. And Paul's response is, yes, it's true. What's happened to the meat when it's sacrificed to the idols, it's meaningless. But on the other hand, if a new believer seeing you eating this is confused or feels if it causes them to stumble, in other words, if they start to feel like, well, that maybe worshiping idols is okay, then you should give it up. He says, Christ gave up his life for that person. Won't you at least be willing to give up going to dinner for him? Because as you say, it doesn't really make any difference, but it does make a difference if you hurt your friend and risk his eternal ruin. Now, Paul comes back to this question in chapter 10, reiterating the dangers of worshiping idols, but not just talking about new Christians, but also talking about people who are non-believers and how it's going to affect them. And his summary statement is, we want to live well, but our foremost efforts should be to help others live well. With that as a base to work from, common sense can take you the rest of the way. So bottom line that Paul has about their concerns is, whether you eat or you drink, whatever you do everything to the glory of God. And I want you to keep this in mind, because we're going to look at this in light of some of the baseline things that he says to the Corinthians about how they make their decisions. Back to the influence of the city on the church. Not unlike our world today, the gap in this city between the wealthy and the poor was huge. And these class distinctions were starting to show up in very visible and very negative ways in the Lord's Supper. Because when they came together, instead of all bringing dishes and sharing them like a potluck, the rich were eating their food, and the poor were left hungry and kind of humiliated because they had very meager resources. And in order to correct this situation, Paul goes back to the circumstances and the purposes of the Lord's Supper. And it's interesting because this letter, written in the 50s, predates the writing of the Synoptic Gospels. This is probably the earliest recording of the institution of the Lord's Supper. And this is where Paul goes through those words that are so familiar that we heard this morning. You know, this is my body that's for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This cup is the new covenant, my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. And so it's interesting to me how these issues and problems in the church brought rich, deep theological stuff for us out. Paul goes on in chapters 12 and 14 to address the topic of spiritual gifts, which is one that the Corinthians are very concerned about. What are more spiritual? And Paul seems to have a fuller understanding of what's going on in the church here. The first thing because he knows the group so well, the first thing he does is use the brilliant metaphor of body parts and say it's just like parts of the body. No one part is better than the other. You need all the parts to be working together. And that's the way spiritual gifts work. But he goes on specifically to talk about speaking in tongues. And he understands why this is such a, speaking in tongues and prophecy, and he understands why this is so important and such a big question to a lot of the Corinthians. And that's because at the time of Paul, that Paul was there, Oriental mystery religions were very popular in that area, and there were lots of adherents of these. And the most popular was the Isis cult, whose magical power was supposed to be greater than all the gods. So you can see how this would impact views of members of the church on spiritual gifts that seem to reflect spiritual mysteries. And again, Paul is concerned about how these normally good gifts could impact members of the church, how they could be misunderstood, if there was speaking in tongues but no translation, if there was prophecies that confused. And so he concludes, "So my friends, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order." And now you know where that phrase that we in the Presbyterian Church love to quote comes from. But the most important part of Paul's response comes in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. And this is usually quoted at weddings, and I think a lot of times looked at outside of its context in Scripture, because what Paul is saying here when he goes through this chapter on love is you can have all the spiritual gifts in abundance, but if you don't have love, if it doesn't characterize how you use your gifts, then basically they're useless. He writes about the importance of love, and he's not talking about romantic love here. He's talking about the way of living that thinks more of others than it does of itself. And he has a great description of what love is. It's patient, it's kind, it's not envious or boastful. Any of those of you who've read this through, you cut to the conviction because it bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things. So that becomes very key to his understanding of the use of gifts. And he moves on to another expression of love in chapter 16, and then in 2 Corinthians, both chapters 8 and 9, where he talks about a relief collection for the Christians in Jerusalem. Now, there was a severe famine there. The Christians in Jerusalem were suffering badly, and Paul is raising funds to take back to the church there. And he writes eloquently about how giving should grow out of love and Christ's supreme model of self-giving. Each of you must give as you've made up your mind to give, not reluctantly under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So as we look back on everything that Paul's written to the Corinthians, there are two critical questions, and I'm going to suggest that those are probably, if there's one takeaway for you today, it is that we need to think about looking at our life the way Paul asks us to, through the filter of these two questions. First, does how I'm living bring glory to God? And secondly, does how I'm living reflect an attitude of love towards others? Despite all the diverse topics in Corinthians, Paul keeps coming back to apply these two principles to how we live. He says a couple of times in Corinthians, all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. In other words, if it doesn't build you up, if it doesn't build others up, and if it doesn't honor God, then perhaps it's not something you want to engage in. Now, I only have 5 minutes, so I'll try and run through this. Last week, Carter promised that I would take up some of those difficult issues that show up in Paul's writings. Thanks, Carter. In a large portion of 2 Corinthians and chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians, Paul talks a lot about himself. So I think it would be good to understand what's going on here. There were challenges to Paul's legitimacy as an apostle. And these seem to particularly show up in the Corinthian church again and again. I think it's again influenced by the culture, because they had cultural expectations for a leader. I think some of them are similar to ours. First of all, the Corinthians were drawn to leaders that were handsome and articulate and confident, like Apollos. And Paul isn't that. He says, when I came to you, I came in weakness and in fear. And he even says, they describe him as his letters are brawny and potent, but in person he's a weakling, and he mumbles when he talks. Furthermore, Paul says he's had a very intense vision or ecstatic experience that had him swept up into the heaven, but this experience left him with a physical impediment. And because, he says, because of the extravagance of these revelations, so I wouldn't get a big head, I was given the gift of a handicap. That's the thorn in the flesh that we read about. And he never gets rid of that. So these are things that influence his ability to present. Also, his financial status. He and Barnabas decided not to ask for support from the church, but work by their hands. And that had a couple of severe consequences. Because, first of all, as a result of that decision, the Corinthians thought they didn't need to support Christian workers. And he goes through the laws in the Old Testament and shows that that's an important thing. But secondly, because they were working with their hands, they were looked down as being crude and common laborers, not intellectual, sophisticated intellectuals who wouldn't stoop to physical labor. So he says, we're not peddlers of the gospel, but instead we're proclaiming what we've received. Thirdly, there were attacks from false apostles, and I'm not going to go into his whole thing here, but he basically goes toe-to-toe with them and says, I can take on any of you. And he sarcastically calls them super apostles. And finally is the issue of suffering. The Corinthians' view of leaders was that they should be flourishing and successful, but instead, Paul's life was marked by persecution and suffering. And he says, though, that this is something he can boast about because this is something that aligns him with Christ. So I think the Corinthians' expectations regarding a leader that Paul doesn't always fit into makes him sound defensive. But in this, there are some deep theological statements that we can take away what it means to think about what it means to be a leader. I'll go through this really quickly. The last thing is the role of women. And I'm not going to go through all of the things here, but Paul makes some statements that sound extremely patriarchal. And it would be great if we had time to go through the exegetical analysis of these, but we don't. Some of these things, like he says that women should be silent in the church, but the irony is just 3 chapters before, he said that women should only pray and prophesy when they have their head covered, kind of expecting that they are going to speak in the church. So there's a lot of contradictions, and it's difficult to understand what Paul's saying in a lot of these situations. But I'm going to suggest that what we should take into trying to figure this out is the things that we do understand and we do know. The first is that Paul wrote that there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free. There's no longer male or female, for you are one in Christ. Now, this radical statement about gender equality in the context of a patriarchal culture is something we can't ignore when we try to understand what Paul's saying. I think the second thing we need to look at is Paul's actual relationship with women, because he not only shows acceptance, but also encouragement of their gifts of leadership in the church. Lydia is a wealthy merchant woman who becomes the foundation of the church in Philippi. Paul's close relationship with Priscilla shows up in the fact that he has not bothered in the least that she instructs Apollos and corrects him on theological issues. He also refers to Lois and Eunice, who are the ones who instructed Timothy, his good friend and co-worker. But I think the most striking fact is that Paul gives the task of delivering the longest and his most theological of his letters to the church in Rome, and that's Phoebe. And the significance of this role is astounding because the carrier of the letter was expected to be able to interpret, to comment on, and to answer questions regarding that document. And he gives her one of his highest endorsements as a member and leader of the church in Caesarea. And finally, at the end of Romans, in Romans 16, he sends greetings to 27 people who he's ministered closely with, and 9 of them are women. And one of them, Junia, it's interesting, she is described as prominent among the apostles. And this possibility that Paul was including a woman as apostle was so threatening to biblical translators that for many years her name was changed to Junius, to make her look like a man. So I'd like to suggest, before we judge Paul too harshly for both defending his ministry and his comments about women, that we go back to the fact that we're looking at fragments of one side of a conversation that can lead to inaccurate or confusing conclusions. But buried in this text are rich theological truths that help us understand how our lives should look in a divided and corrupt social context. And next week, we have Barry doing Galatians and Ephesians.
Thank you, Donna. That was very helpful. And thank you for bringing up all the historical parts and piecing, as much as we could, to piece this together. Thank you. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your words to us. And give us wisdom to hear them, even though the context where they're given is different, yet your Spirit speaks to us this day. Amen.